Welcome. I'd like to just go through a little bit of Zoom housekeeping here before we start. Obviously, please mute your audio. We are going to be recording this meeting once we finish the initial introduction. So, Cheryl, am I showing record now? Yes, okay, I can see you shaking
Yes,
your
you
head.
are.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Lynn. I'm going to mute myself now.
So I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer served as the first executive director and currently serves on the advisory board of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organization that works to reduce political dysfunction and incivility in our political system. As a leader in the field of deliberative democracy, she works to restore our democracy to reflect the intended vision of our founding fathers. She is engaged in many national democracy projects, included Divided We Fall TV and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practices of Democratic Citizenship. Previously, she founded America Speaks, served as consultant to the White House Chief of Staff, and was the Chief of Staff to Ohio Governor Richard F. Celeste. We're just absolutely delighted to have Dr. Lukensmeyer with us today, and what a timely program. Our participation today is at a record level for Greater Verde Valley. So again, we're just very happy to have you with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Lynn and Marianne, thank you very much. And when this invitation came in from the League and from OLLI in Arizona, it was a slam dunk. Yes, of course. We have very much appreciated the opportunity to work with chapters all over the state of Arizona, and OLLI's been a friend right from the beginning of the creation of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. Lynn, you mentioned Katie Hobbs in one of your upcoming programs. And one of the things that in the conflict that we're now watching play out in terms of the current administration not gracefully engaging in a transition, I think something has been lost for us as a nation to sufficiently celebrate the extraordinary election that we just went through. It looks like it may in the end be upwards of 160 million plus people, the largest number of people that have ever voted in the United States of America. And certainly that's been part of the League's mission, and I'm sure OLLI was on the ground helping as well. And I want to give an extraordinary shout out to secretaries of state all over the United States, but particularly to Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Arizona, where the kind of attack and fraudulent accusations have just been nonstop. And as I've watched each of those very, very dedicated public servants, there's no question, but we were in good hands for this election, and all the way down to the county officials, both low wage earners and volunteers, who made this the extraordinary capacity to deal when never before did we have to deal with the virus, and how that forced us, whether we wanted to or not, to actually make it possible for people to vote in as many different ways to keep us safe. So I think we haven't celebrated this election at the level that it deserves, regardless of who you voted for. We did what America stands for in this election. Having said that, I will also say that many months before this election was over, a part of my standard talking points and speeches was that regardless of whoever won the election, there would be millions of Americans who felt like the election was rigged. Now, when I was saying that, I had no idea that it would become an actual strategy to try to not acknowledge President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. Excuse me. But the bottom line is, we are now witnessing the most divided that we, the public, have ever been in this country since the Civil War. And it's stunning. If you look, it's amazing. Okay, Joe Biden won the most votes of any candidate for president. Donald Trump won the second most votes for any candidate for president. So we have people really dug in two different views of the world, and likely in large numbers getting their information and facts. It's like we do have two universes going on side by side. A democracy cannot withstand that in the long run. So our topic today, calling we the people to really help heal our culture, our communities, and our conversations. You know, Joe Biden made his closing message the need to heal our divides and to create unity in the country. And he tapped something. It clearly resonated with millions of people. But Joe Biden can't do that by himself. And given that we are going to have divided government, my hope is that the Biden administration focuses that energy on healing the divides and creating unity with us, the larger public. We already have enough evidence that focusing that kind of energy in Congress alone is highly unlikely to be able to make much traction. So it's always true in the United States, in my experience, that whatever the level of activism during the election, it drops off enormously after the election because people feel like I did my civic duty. The winners, I got what I wanted, the losers leaving the field. But we today are in a different place in the United States and America. If we really want to heal our divides and once again create a national narrative that the vast majority of us share and believe in, it will take all of us to participate in that process. If we leave it to the Biden-Harris administration, it will without question make very little progress in the short run. We said, and we announced this, that we talk a little bit about how we got here. And I am going to do that, but it is indeed going to be only a little bit. And each of you could give this part of the talk in your own way. And Cheryl, can you put up that one PowerPoint, please?
Okay, did you want to run the poll too, Carolyn, first?
Well,
or no?
I think I'm going to do the causes first and then do the
Okay.
poll. Sorry.
Okay, sounds good. Will do.
You know what? If you're ready to do the poll, let's just do the poll because it fits with all the comments I've just made very well.
Okay, sounds good.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
So again, just using your keyboard, what is your reaction to the statement? I am confident that we will be able to make significant progress on healing our divides over the next 4 years. I strongly disagree. I disagree. I neither agree or disagree. I may not know what I feel about that. I agree or I strongly agree. Please just take a minute and click on the box that fits how you feel about that. What do you really believe?
And we'll take another couple of seconds here for you to put your answers in. And then we'll share the poll. All right.
So 8% of us strongly disagree, 39% disagree. So that's about 47% of us that don't feel particularly confident. A quarter of us neither have a sense of strong agreement or disagreement, and about 30% of us agree or strongly agree. So I think my guess is that poll, what you have said, those of us, the 60 plus or 70 plus that are together today, probably is a fair representation of how people across the country feel. Staying as we go through today, how you feel about that may in fact impact some of the ideas I'm going to put out. So I want to invite you to stay with that feeling, or also to notice when something we talk about shifts that feeling, either increases your confidence or decreases your confidence. So briefly, I want to talk a little bit because we didn't get here because Americans are bad people. We didn't get here because Donald Trump held the kind of presidency that he did, although he became a cause. But there are a lot of structural issues in how our elections rules operate that actually, over some number of decades, have brought us to the place that we are. Money in politics. You know, I go back to the Clinton, George Herbert Walker Bush race in 1992. The total amount of money spent by both those candidates and the Democratic Republican Party was $73 million. Today, we are spending, each candidate, $1 billion or more. And we don't have the numbers for 2020, but for 2016, which was the first time Citizens United was really fully open for implementation, it was something near $8 billion spent on the election. Gerrymandering. 95% of the districts in the House are not really competitive because Republicans or Democrats, although the Republicans have used it significantly more in the last 20 years, set the districts so that by definition they become red districts or blue districts, but reducing the number of districts that are truly competitive. A myriad of election rules: how you vote, where you vote, do you have to have an ID, do you have to have a signature on your absentee ballot? And then the last two bullets are how our information ecosystem is completely different than the one that you and I, all of us on this call, grew up in, and grew in an environment in which if Walter Cronkite said it, we all knew it was true. Didn't matter who we were going to vote for. When cable went to 24/7, I'm sorry, but there aren't enough new events to have a 24/7 news cycle. We see the same news repeated time and time and time again in that 24-hour cycle. And then, of course, the advent of social media, which when it came about, we had great hopes that it would democratize how information was shared and that we all could play a part in that. Unfortunately, social media became a broadcast medium rather than an engagement conversation medium. And we all know the horror stories about bullying at all levels. And I need not say more. Each of you would have your own personal stories to talk about these, and you probably have some other thoughts. But all of these are major, macro structural changes in our society that all of us, this is like the air we breathe, the water we drink. This is the environment in which we are engaging in politics. So let me make an important point here. Anytime you want to create transformational change, whether that's in how your church is gaining new members, or whether that's in how we bring Spanish as a second language into the schools, something that would really transform how an organization works. In this case, how our politics would work. It requires intense work on both the behavioral and cultural level and on the structural and systemic level. Both have to happen. It's not possible to really have a change that is sustained without work on both of these levels. I think Cheryl's going to put in the chat a couple of sources to go to. Let's say you want to work on gerrymandering. That's one that there's already a lot of evidence that there will be a lot of work done at the citizen level, like happened in Michigan, where the choice about how to redistrict is taken out of the hands of the governors and legislators altogether and put in the hands of a citizen commission. Missouri had that on their ballot this year. I should have checked before the call. I don't know, Cheryl, you know, I don't remember if it passed or didn't pass. We know there are about 10 states that are planning to put that on their ballots in the next general election. So there are many ways to engage in the structural change. And out of this call, any of you have a question, we'd be happy to link you to that. But for our focus today, we're going to really focus on the behavioral and cultural change. What are the things, you know, long before coronavirus hit, I was giving speeches from the National Institute that polarization started in Congress. It didn't start with the public. Because of election rules, like how primaries are run, very quickly primaries pushed candidates to run further and further to the right and further to the left. So to get past the primary, members of Congress started playing to that base party, which is, most 15, 16, 17%. So then it began to seep into the public. And we're now at a place, what I said, which I can't quite say anymore, is this partisanship, this otherizing, it became like a virus in our culture. It was in our families, our places of faith, our places of work. I'll never forget the heartbreak that I felt in 2016 after the election, the phone calls, emails, social media messages that NICD got from families. What are we going to do at Thanksgiving? And that has only increased year after year after year. So our focus today are going to be, what can we, the people, do to impact this issue of how we are demonizing and otherizing people because they voted for the other candidate. Now, I'm also going to stop there and talk very candidly for a minute. And earlier in the week, when Marianne and Lynn and Cheryl and I talked, this really came very clear to me. We're in a very unique spot at this point. Many, many people who are thrilled that Joe Biden won cannot wrap their minds around how 70+ million people could vote for Donald Trump, given how he has behaved in office for 4 years, or come to grips with Donald Trump got 11 more million votes in the popular vote in 2020 than he got in 2016. And for those of us who sit on the side of having voted for Vice President Biden, we ourselves may now find it more difficult to be generous and inviting of people who held that position and stayed connected to what we see as authoritarianism, as disrespect of many, many groups of people. And I hope in the way I'm speaking literally as a deeply dedicated citizen who cares about our democracy. I have had to do my own struggles, but I learned an enormous amount of how to listen to the other side in all the work that we did at NICD. And it's going to be many times more challenging now for many, many people on the blue center left side. It used to be more difficult for people on the center right side. I think we're probably now looking at a moment in American history when the gut response to whether I can really respect where those others are is as tenuous as it has been since the Civil War. Next slide, please. Fundamentally, we are in an extraordinary crisis of trust in this country. Gallup polls started taking polls about trust post-World War II. And up until the mid-60s in Vietnam and anti-war movement, that trust in all of our institutions just was growing, growing, growing. And we've now gone through several spikes that were related to the Vietnam War, that were related to 9/11, but we're now sitting in a place where trust has evaporated to single-digit levels in every institution in the culture. And I believe that the most frightening part of all, and the reason why our conversation today is so important, is we now are below 50% substantially on the question of how much do we trust each other? Do I believe that you will do what you say you will do? Can I have confidence that you are being authentic in what you say to me? And this is why this issue of working in any of the circles where I am trusted, That's the fundamental message. No, neither you nor I are going to convince, or many, many millions of us are not going to convince the woman at GSA to do the accreditation that will open up the traditional transition process. But there are all of us. We sit in circles where we have influence. And it is in those circles where we can plan strategies around how we broaden those circles, invite more people into them, and how our goal can be rebuilding trust step by step by step in our families, our places of faith, our places of worship, and yes, again, in the United States government as the important institution it is in our democracy. All right, let me go one more slide, Cheryl. This is something that people often lose sight of. And in some ways, I would say to you, if you don't take away anything else that I say today, I hope this one sticks. Human beings are very, very social beings. We respond profoundly to the context we're in, the structure we're in, and the signals we are receiving in those structures and contexts. This is why President Trump's response to white nationalism has been so dangerous for our country, in that it has been a signal to people who hate at that level that it's okay to both speak that hate and to behave on that hate. Many of those people held that someplace internally, but over the decades, particularly since the 50s and 60s, we come to a place where people felt their job was to get over that, or at least to not let it be public if they felt incapable of getting over it. In work that I did at America Speaks on debt and deficit, we saw where people were given facts, no matter if they came in as a conservative or a liberal, you gave them the facts, they actually cut the US deficit by $23 trillion by 2025. But those very same people in the election of 2010 reverted to norm when they were in the middle of a campaign and constantly being bombarded by one message from one side and the other message from the other side. And that frankly led to the creation of the Tea Party. These same people, different contexts, different signals, solved the problem. Once they were back in the voting booth and dealing with nothing but negative campaigning, it's like they forgot they ever solved the problem. I hope that's a specific enough example to make my point. So as we're thinking about these conversations that I hope all of you will choose to initiate, we have to think about the structure in which they happen and the signals in which people get as they are invited to participate. Cheryl, I think that's the place we want to stop, isn't it? To open this, either take some questions from chat or frankly, just open it up to all of you on the call to take some questions, to make some questions.
Yeah, I think for a few minutes, Carolyn, and I think Lynn was going to help facilitate that for us.
Okay, any questions that people have, go ahead and type that in chat. And or is there a way that people can ask the question if they want to?
While you're thinking, I see that Susan Williams put in the chat. Susan's from Missouri and has joined us and is telling us that we lost the fight against changing gerrymandering. Well, very often in initiatives and referendums, it loses the first time. The goal is to get it back on the ballot the second time. Thank you, Susan.
If anybody else has a question at this moment, we will have another Q&A part to this. You can either type it into the chat or you can raise your hand and open your mic.
So for somebody like me who loves to interact with people, Zoom has definite limits. So at least for those of you who I can see, if what I'm saying makes sense to you, that you're following it along, a thumbs up would be very helpful to me. If that's not the case, I need the thumbs down. Oh, that's right. Even those of you I can't see, you can do it in your participant tag with the little yellow thumbs up.
I do have a question that came through a moment ago.
Great.
Do you have a recommendation on how to engage communities in conversations that reconnect us?
Actually, that's the whole segment that we're going to speak about next. And yes, I have some very clear principles to follow. And hopefully, if you will just be patient with, rather than answering you now and repeating it, I will go into that in the next unit very deeply as we can in the time we have.
Good, and we have a couple other questions that came up, but I think they may be clarified some as you continue, so maybe we'll come back to them.
Lynn, I do see that a couple of those are about media, both social
Mhm.
media and the issue of where our facts come from. And I want to be sure that we come back to that before we stop today. So help me do that, please.
Good.
Okay.
I do see a couple people have had their hands raised, like Terry.
Ah, yes. Terry Fernetti, let's go ahead and open the mic so she can.
Terry, you can open your mic.
Yes, hi. I apologize, but I hit the that instead of the thumbs up. My apologies.
The beauty of Zoom.
Right. No apology necessary, Terry. No problem.
Glad to have you here, Terry.
Thanks.
So I do see one question that I'm going to comment on, and then maybe we should segue into the things that people want to get into in depth. I see that Karen Crow asked, what would I say is the most hopeful sign that I've seen lately that we can heal the divide? And I'm going to try to I'm going to answer on two levels. One, I'm going to go right to the election we just came through. Never before has a presidential candidate running for office spoken that it is our responsibility to do something to abolish systemic racism. That has not ever occurred before in American history. Now, of course, that issue divides some of us, but for the most powerful person in our public square to acknowledge that part of the healing that has to go on is to deal with the systemic racism that has been a part of this divide forever has got to be. In fact, if you remember in the primary, practically every candidate acknowledged something after George Floyd's murder. And the way we watched it meant that literally millions of white Americans have shifted their understanding of what it means to be Black in this country. I think that is an incredibly hopeful sign about the potential for healing our divides. Now, saying that is step one, or maybe it's even just getting to the home plate to step up to bat. That has to be followed by policies and practices. But as you've seen in many cities across the country, it doesn't have to wait for the feds to do something about redlining, although hope they will. Local communities have begun to step up and shift public policies that can impact systemic racism in their communities. So second level, because we're also talking about what can citizens do. One of the pleasures that Cheryl and I had for running Revive Civility over a 4-year period of time, in which something like 60,000 Americans participated in which we had a footprint in many, many states. The number of Americans that know how wrong where we are, how wrong it is, and they want to do something about it. Let's say it's even just 50% of us that are hovering around the center right, center left. But if we actually touched 50% of the population, half of that who voted for Biden and half of that who voted for Trump in these conversations, that would have an enormous impact in communities across our country. So I feel profoundly hopeful in the numbers of Americans in every state, red, blue, or purple, that we have run into in the last 4 years, that want to do something about this? Thank you for the question. Okay, shall we go? So remember what I said about context, structure, and signals. If we want to engage in this conversation with people and really try to help us get across our differences, we have to really very intentionally set up the conditions for people to listen for understanding. When you're getting people together to start to cross the divide, you don't start by talking about, I'm for the wall, you're against the wall. It's a commitment to, and maybe given the recency of the election, it is who you voted for, but that may be too touchy. But whatever you choose to talk about where you know you have a difference in viewpoint, the goal of the conversation is to listen for understanding. I'm going to listen to you long enough to understand how your life experience has led you to be so strongly in support along the border wall in Arizona. And I'm going to stay with you until I understand that. And then I'll have my turn. You're going to listen to me long enough to understand why I really think the wall is a mistake. That is the most basic fundamental principle. Number one, you're spending a much larger time listening than talking. And your goal is not to influence the other person. Your goal is to listen for understanding. Now, you probably already know, you've tried this a couple times and you get quickly into it and you are triggered. You know the person said something that isn't factual, or you know that how much you strongly feel that that's not right. And when you're triggered, you'll get a physiological signal quickly. You'll stop breathing. Some of us are really unlucky. Our faces turn red, but your body will tell you that you have been triggered. So here's what we recommend when that happens, when you're starting to engage in the conversation. Take a deep breath or a couple deep breaths. That will start to shift your interior physiological experience. And then rather than starting to argue, rather than starting to put in a fact that goes against the fact they believe in, ask a question. So in order to stay, if it's your turn to do the listening, 2 clues when you start to feel tension about it: breathe and ask another question. Okay, let's do the next slide. A big shift. And notice I've used the word trust here. Somehow, as we engage in this, whether it's a one-on-one or it might be a church group or it may be our family around the table at Thanksgiving, we need to step back into how can I rediscover the ground on which I actually know this person is a fellow American, not an enemy. And frankly, if you can't find that ground with the particular person or the particular context you're in, then I'd say this is not the place for you to be the initiator of this kind of conversation. Someplace inside yourself, you have to find the space to say, even though I can't understand why this person voted for Donald Trump again, but you want to understand it enough that what you focus on them is, this is a fellow American. This is somebody who loves their kids just as much as I do. This is a member of my family. This is a member of my church. I've worked with this person for 10 years. We've done projects together. I do trust this person in so many areas of their life. So how can I block out this sense that they're the enemy and refocus on their fellow Americans? The other thing, and this is a tough one for both liberals and conservatives. I don't know which of the 2 groups it's the toughest for, but it's tough. Don't enter the conversation unless you truly know that it's a 2-way street. Something in how you think could be changed, as well as something about how the other person's mind might change. I'll give you a personal example here. given what Trump is doing to try to delegitimize the most sacred foundational element of our democracy, the integrity of the vote, I myself was really challenged about what does it mean that 70 million Americans really voted for him again, and if even just 50% of them really think the Democrats stole the election, how on earth is the Biden-Harris administration going to accomplish anything? So I took the time to recontact some people that I'd worked with through NICD in community level conversations, and frankly, to contact some members of my own extended family that are evangelical Christians. And I started the conversation by saying, I would like to know, as you made a choice this time in the election, who you voted for, if you're willing to talk with me about that, and how you feel about the attack on the integrity of the vote. Most interesting to me were the evangelical Christians. But they are family, extended family members, so we know each other pretty well. And they laughed and they said, Carolyn, you're forgetting that most of us voted for Donald Trump on a single issue, abortion. We don't approve of what Donald Trump has done on many other levels. And no, we don't think Biden stole the election. So I'm giving you examples to try to say what it takes to enter a conversation where it may be your mind that shifted rather than the person who was holding a different opinion shifting. I hope that was helpful.
Mhm.
Okay, so I'll back up to finish my statement. Obviously, I live in Washington, D.C. There were not 1 million Trump supporters here this weekend by any means, but several tens of thousands. Those are people who really do believe the election was rigged. In terms of the work we're doing right now in this call and you can do in your community, that's not the target group. The target group is people who really are concerned about how the fabric of our community life has been torn by our politics. And maybe some of those people will be engaged, but they're not the primary target group. Okay. I'm very conscious of time. I think we're okay, aren't we, Cheryl? Give me a head nod. So some kind of bullet points that we often use when we're training people to do this work. And the television episode that we created called "With Divided We Fall," and if we haven't done that already, we'll put it in the chat room, because frankly, we found that watching Divided We Fall across people who hold different views opens up a fabulous conversation, because the context, they've just watched a documentary of highly Trump supporters and highly Trump resistors walk through a conversation and surprise themselves that they have more in common than they have in difference. It's called Divided We Fall, Unity Without Tragedy. And I do hope that all of you will watch it. Cheryl, you'll put that in the chat room, right? So it was one of the cameramen who was filming as we were doing this work. And we did it with a group of Generation Xers around Boston. And then we did it with a group of millennials around Chicago. So very diverse folks in combination, you'll see in this hour documentary. And he watched all of this and he saw profound changes happen in people. And he came up with the phrase, listen with curiosity, not animosity. And that's a quick internal check any of us to do. Am I really curious about this other person? Or am I just kind of sitting back here holding on to, I don't believe you did this, but I'm going to talk to you anyway, you get my point. So the first bullet just says that in more words and not as cleverly. Approach the conversation with curiosity, with an open mind, and frankly, with an open heart. That's another issue here in terms of how we have closed this balance of hate and love. Think of all the kind of quotes we have from Abraham Lincoln about this, from we really do have to come to a place where our politics is infused with love rather than with hate. And we're right now dealing with a politics that is highly infused with hate. Cheryl, the slide clicked back one. But while she's changing it, I'll go on to the next bullet, which I remember. So again, talk a little less, focus more on the other person. Learn by asking questions. My, oh my. Pay attention to the nonverbal communication. If you've been on a good roll with each other and then something shifted, you're going to see it non-verbally probably before you see it or hear it verbally. And you know, something, I think the internet has speeded up all of our lives to a very unhealthy level. And we are just into action, 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 reaction, which means none of us are spending enough time reflecting in our lives. And that's another piece of advice I would give you as you think about where you want to do some of this work. Spend some time reflecting about your own capacity to vision making a difference in it and how you will have to conduct yourself. But our little bullet here is, you know, it's okay while you're having this conversation for there to be real moments of silence. We've almost come, it's like something's wrong if there's a moment of silence. Silence is precious. Silence gives us time to think. Silence gives us time to make a choice about how I want to respond, not just to react to you. So those are some clues. Hope you found them helpful.
Thanks,
I think
Carolyn.
what we wanted to do is some more Q&A here, and then I want to be sure that we have enough time to actually get right into the level of action. What you can do as an individual in the circles of influence that you are in, and then also what chapters, what organizations might want to do as some community action. But really, if there are some questions, there's much longer time we could spend on this. I'm going to give you another resource while people are looking, Cheryl, to put in the chat room. Another organization doing this work called Essential Partners has actually put up on their website the sort of a script for a conversation. If you want to talk to a Trump supporter, if you want to talk to a Biden supporter, if you want to take a step of crossing this divide with an individual who you know voted differently than you do, it's a very practical guide. Their work is great. Essential Partners. All right, do we have some questions?
We do. I see one here. How do we get potential voters to a common or shared set of facts?
Well, that is one of the toughest challenges we're facing. And remember when I said at the beginning that these issues are structural, not just behavioral? Well, that may be the most profound structural change we're dealing with, is now having partisan news outlets on every medium, whether it's television, radio, internet, social media. And I'll tell you what I've done in a few cases that I personally am very invested in getting back to a place where we share information that we both believe in. I have made an agreement with a couple of special people in my life to each of us share a source of news that we have utter confidence in, and their podcasts. I chose for mine Heather Cox Richardson. I don't know if you happen to know her podcast, but she's a historian and she is quite extraordinary in terms of how she links today's events into historical facts about our country. And the agreement I've made is that every day, this is with my brother, he's picking, and he hasn't sent it to me yet, so I don't know what the source is, so I can't tell you. He's picking a source that he trusts, that's more partisan on the right, or that would be, I'm sure, perceived by me as partisan on the right. We have agreed to read each of these sources, identify where the sources reference different facts. So we're reading along, we think this is great, we think this is great, and then, oh my God, she said this, he said that. And we will then do the work to track back to the sources of those facts. Now, this is my brother, so I'm going to expend that energy. What I'm most interested in, I listened to, I'm not going to remember her name. I heard her on the NewsHour last week, but she's one of the foremost researchers on the impact of social media on this issue of truth. And part of what we all need to do is identify a lot of sources that are nonpartisan and that are putting out the facts. But her bottom line was we have to engage with each other enough that we trust each other again, and then walk back to what we're using as our news sources. It kind of blew my mind when she said that. She's this huge social media expert. I fully expected her to put out some big anecdote about social media. Now, she and a lot of other people, Knight Foundation has invested more money than this than any other private foundation, are trying to find locally based, what we're calling civic media outlets. The one I know best, and you might want to look at it as a model that you could use in your own community, is called Your Ohio Voices. This is now a news source in Ohio in which 34 different news outlets are sharing data with each other and coming to a place where they put out facts based on what citizens want to learn. Another great source or example is one called Chalk Beat. A lovely young woman named Elizabeth Green started it because of her concern that in the world of education, we're now split about where we get our facts. So she's picked, I don't remember the exact number, 5 or 6 states where she has dedicated herself to becoming the fact-based news source on education, how the money's flowing, how the policy's flowing. So helping to create civic media on a local level is something, again, I think chapter like league chapters, OLLI chapters, this might be something you want to collaborate on. I was a member of a commission, which I know we're planning to put in the chat if we haven't done it already, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which was created by Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, that whole crew, who knew that the government would need a source of facts. So they've been operating ever since the late 1700s. And we had a commission that operated for 2.5 years called the Practice of Democratic Citizenship. We released our report on June 11th. And we'll put the link to the report up in the, and maybe Lynn, you and Marianne could actually send it out as an email afterwards because people will lose the chat. But in that report, we have a whole section on what it will take to create civic media. It'll be much harder to break the national cable, to break the Rush Limbaughs of the country. But if we focus locally and create these sources, for one thing, when we did Divided We Fall, these people who were so opposed to one another, we offered them fact checkers for their first discussion on immigration. They said they didn't need them. When they went through the first discussion, they came back and said, we need them. They actually quickly realized that they were holding a lot of opinions about immigration on which they actually had no idea what the facts were. Or they were holding on to a fact from a very partisan outlet, which people who weren't part of that view could quickly put enough information on the table to make it clear that that wasn't a fact. Now, that's a pretty long question to that, or answer to that question, but it's something I was going to talk about in the last segment. I do think, particularly in a geography like Flagstaff or Sedona or the county, really thinking, is there a school of journalism in the University of Northern Arizona? Could you talk to someone there about their willingness to hook up with your two organizations to actually create a civic media source for people? You know, and I'll have to say this, PBS and NPR are the best we've got. So up until you start to create some of your own, helping bring people along to using NPR and PBS as their source. And I know the far right has done the best job or has tried as hard as they can to say PBS is part of the liberal media. Well, for any of you who watch it, it just isn't factually the case. I think I could go on, but I think I probably should stop. Was that helpful?
Definitely. There's a number of questions. So my question for you is, do we continue with them, or would you like to go on a little bit and then come back to the questions?
Well, we just did such a good job about one example for organizational or community action. I'm fine to go on a bit longer with the questions, and I think I can make the points that I wanted to make in the last section. As long, Cheryl, make sure that we save at least 20 minutes for that last section, okay? Or
Okay,
15,
so then,
or actually 15 is enough.
yeah. So we've got about 5 more minutes before we go into that point then, that time, if we want to do breakouts.
Okay. Here's another question about civic education. The educational system, Charlotte Newton says, has done its part in contributing to the current state of affairs by removing the instruction of civics, history of Western civilization. How best to rectify the knowledge base of the young going forward of how the government's structured and works, and reintroduce those topics to the curricula?
A very, very important question. I'm going to go back to our documentary, Divided We Fall. One of the things when teachers started showing in their classrooms, they were very excited about that as a stimulus for their students to really get into issues about civics and how we bridge the divides. So up on the website of Divided We Fall, now there's a whole bunch of discussion questions to go with the documentary. Students today are not going to sit through the kind of government education classes that you and I went through. They just would see them as boring. They would, you know that. Sandra Day O'Connor, who was one of the founding chairs of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, dedicated herself to 2 kinds of activism when she left the Supreme Court. The first was to get judges no longer to be elected, to get partisanship out of judges, whatever level. The second was to reintroduce civics into schools in a meaningful way. So she created something called iCivics, small I, SIVICS.org. Go to it, look at the web. It's now in about 55,000 classrooms is my understanding. I haven't looked at it recently, but that was her effort to say young people have to be engaged, and they do it as games. They do it as actually participating. Some units of curriculum have been created where students' job is to identify and solve a problem in the community. Well, to solve the problem, they have to learn how the city hall works, or they have to learn how the county commission works. So a shift to experiential learning rather than memorization is very, very critical in terms of reintroducing meaningful education about our democracy. The actual report that I told you, which is Our Common Purpose from the Commission, a whole section of that report is also dedicated to potential changes in civics education. So it's a hugely important issue, and one to engage with your local school board. School boards make decisions about curriculum. So if this is something that you feel passionate about that has been lost statewide in Arizona, have the League and OLLI invite 4 or 5 social studies teachers to an online conversation or a socially distant breakfast and say, we stand ready to help. Do you have what you need to teach civics in a way that really will let next generations of young people absorb the profoundness of the meaning of being born into a democracy? The problem, even with our level of voting up until this year, 40% of Americans standardly don't vote. We have just taken for granted this extraordinary gift we've been given. So civics education is yes, yes, yes. Let's do it.
I have one question here before we take off to the breakouts that I think you can answer fairly quickly, and I'm intrigued by the question. Jennifer LaFair, our president in the Flagstaff chapter, was asking, you mentioned family members who are one-issue voters. Did you engage in this type of discourse with them, like you described with your brother and some of these activities, or are they part of a group that you just leave alone?
Actually, no. My brother is one of those one-issue voters. And what was important to me was to understand whether or not how much of what Trump was doing now in transition that he actually believes in. Did he think this was an illegitimate election? And quickly he disavowed me that no, he didn't. But then I said, look, the two of us could learn a lot from each other. We grew up in the same family. We are still a close family. We hold so many of the same values. So let's commit to where I get my facts and where you get your facts, and seeing where these differences emerge, some of which will be insurmountable, probably, and some of which won't. So yes, I think you definitely can do it with family members. Now, one of the things that I've heard from some families that the Institute supported is that sometimes it's too tense. Well, I'm going to tell one more story. Katie Fahey now runs an organization called The People. And in 2016, after the election, she and her first cousins were talking on the phone. And they were saying, oh my God, do we have to go to Thanksgiving dinner? Uncle John will just be impossible. So they decided, so that there was no discussion of the election or the outcome of it, they said, let's bring up a topic. They're obviously a politically active family. Let's bring up a topic that we know we all care about. So she and her cousins put this proposition on the Thanksgiving room dinner table in 2016, that the state of Michigan should put a ballot on the referendum, put an issue on the referendum ballot to change redistricting out of the governor and legislature and into the hands of a citizen commission. When she started, no, you'll never get enough signatures on time. I think it was 330,000 they needed. They got 440,000, so it's on the ballot. When they introduced their ballot language, it was by both parties challenged in court many times. Long story short, the referendum actually passed. The Republican legislature then did about 6 stages of trying to keep it from being real. So after it had passed by the will of the people, it took another 2 years for it to actually be a law. But it happened, and in the 2020 census, Michigan's districts will be decided by a citizen commission. Now that is a heck of a Thanksgiving dinner story. But I'm telling you, particularly young people, think of where they are in climate. Think of where they are in Black Lives Matter. What we need to do is create conversations where we're comfortable and then watch for that spark. Where do you meet someone who's ready to go, ready to put in a kind of energy that you would have done in your 30s or maybe even your 40s or maybe even your 50s or maybe still. But we have to think about making these conversations across the difference just become one step toward actively engaging in solving a problem in our community, or actively engaging in dealing even a thread to our representatives on these national issues. We got 5 existential threats to what it means to be an American in this democracy today. COVID, our lives, COVID, our livelihoods, climate change, racial injustice, and the very fabric of our democratic institutions. There's enough to be done. So how do you take that first step, identifying, crossing the bridges is what we're talking about today. And I get very excited. I really believe in this stuff. And I'm not saying to be in this phone, you got to take on climate change. My only message in telling the Katie Fay story was watch for a spark. Where you see a spark, support that spark to go as far as it can go.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thanks for the question, Jennifer. Hope it was helpful.
Okay, Carolyn, I think, and Lynn, I think now time to go into set up the breakout rooms.
Great.
Question.
So before we go into the breakout rooms, one of the things that we did look up is how divided is Verde Valley? And you probably already know this, but 64% of people in Verde Valley, Yavapai County is what we checked. 64% voted for Trump, 35 for Biden, 63 for Sally, 36 for Kelly. So you definitely are sitting in a county, and I know there's undoubtedly differences of the urban areas and the outer parts of the county, but you are a place where having these conversations is necessary and could make a difference. So we're asking you, and we're actually going to leave a minute of silence that I spoke about before is so important. Just literally for you to think yourself, if you have a piece of paper, you might want to write it down. Given who I am and my values, how do I want to use my reform energy in 2021? Now, obviously, we've spent a lot of time on bridging conversations, but maybe when you do this reflection, that's not what you want to do. Maybe what you want to do is more direct work on one of these electoral rule issues that still exist in Arizona, whatever that might be. So we're not even trying to say that you have to want to do a bridging conversation, but you're a member of the league, you're a member of OLLI. We believe you have some reform energy. So given who you are and your values, how do you want to use your reform energy in 2021? After you've jotted a couple notes about that, then to rebuild trust within our community, what actions can our league/OLLI group take? And that doesn't mean you have to do it together, but I know there are several chapters represented in this on this phone call. So think of your own chapter that you're in. Just jot what out of this whole, and you may have been thinking about this before, but I do want you to stick with the to rebuild trust within our community on this question. What action could our league or OLLI group take? So we're going to leave at least 30 seconds when I'm not talking for you to jot a couple notes. And when you stop doing that, you'll find yourself in a breakout room. Goes on for this last 5 minutes.
Oh,
It would be nice to see us all.
cool.
Terry.
Hello.
Hello.
Gosh, it's been a long time.
Yes.
Where is
Sure.
everybody?
There- there's-
Oh,
Didn't give you
Sure, hi,
there's
Katie.
Lynn. Hi, Lynn.
So those of you who have already come back in, we would like one person to just put a headline in chat. A limit of the Zoom platform is that when you're in your small group, that chat is only visible to you and is not recorded. So to add to the substance that we all get to see, if just one person from your group would type in a quick
That's
headline
good.
from your experience together into the chat so that there'll be a record of that with this Zoom call. And then as soon as more people are back with us, we're getting there, I think.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I'm on
pretty
call.
much that.
I think we've got everybody back now, Carolyn.
Great. So if one of you, again, from each group would just actually pop something into the chat, then there'll be a good record of it. But why don't we take a couple of minutes for just, we like to call it a popcorn conversation, that, you know, put your hand up and unmute yourself as if you have a zinger of a headline from your small group or just something you'd like to share so we can hear some voices before we have to say goodbye. Anybody who would like. You can raise your hand. You can use that function under participants, or you can just raise your hand.
I'm going to raise my hand. And
Okay.
we talked about trying to agree on basic facts. And the word that comes to, the phrase that comes to my mind is alternative facts. And that just kind of fills me with sort of horror and disbelief.
Well, it is one of the things we're going to have to work very hard to reduce the amount of influence that alternative facts have grown. And just frankly, the distrust of core excellent media that has been sown in the last 4 years. So we've got our work cut out on this one.
I saw Melanie raised her hand just a second ago, and then Marie held.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'm wondering, and I forgive me if you've already mentioned this, but I'm wondering if you can recommend an educational organization that's got some good work they can share in terms of supporting civics education.
That's a really good question. At Tufts University, there is a group, help me, God, for the moment,
Oh.
I'm losing.
You mean Circle?
Circle. Well, that is, they don't so much have this. They've got all the connections across the country, but they don't have, they don't do the
research.
resources.
I think
I'm not sure that
iCivics.
iCivics, yes, iCivics does. I did see in the chat room that somebody said you'd looked at that site some years ago and that it was not representative of the demography of the country. I didn't have time to look it up, but my guess is that has been changed, and I will look it up. And if it hasn't been changed, I will speak to Louise Dubé, who now runs it, because I'm sure their intention is to represent the whole country.
Thank you.
The National Association of Social Studies Teachers might have some resources on their website. That is the association that social studies teachers looked for to introduce new curriculum. So that's the place I'd recommend you take a look.
Thank you.
Another comment?
Did Marie Helt have her hand up?
I did. Melanie in our group had the wonderful suggestion of incorporating civil discourse into our mission statement. And I just thought that was a really good idea because that keeps it front and center in everything that we do. And I thought that was a great suggestion.
That is a great suggestion. And clearly your mission has done that, so you might as well say it, right? Marlene, did you have your hand up, Marlene?
We have
Okay,
a couple of
sorry.
people in the chat who have their hands up. Patricia Carroll and then Kathy Rutherford.
Great.
But Patricia, would you like to? Yo, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, the first comment was something that actually both comments that have been circulating about teaching our kids about civics and civic duties, and that's really important to really reach our kids. And then we had spent a fair amount of time talking about beliefs and how, one of the theories is that the more liberal leaning are embracing science, whereas the Republicans don't really have science in their trust group. So it's trust and belief, and those are hard concepts to break through, and that we all need to just make an effort to start non-threatening conversations. Thank you.
Very well said, Patricia. And it's very part of the the point you're making about beliefs is part of where this issue about looking for alternative facts come from. I actually actively look for something that will support the beliefs I have, rather than exploring facts that would challenge my beliefs. So if this link between trust and belief and information is very profound.
And then we had Kathy Rutherford had her hand up as well.
Yes, and I think we might let Kathy have the last word from our audience today before we go back to Carolyn. So have at it, Kathy.
Well, I was just wondering, Carolyn, if you have done work for where you have created groups that can have these kind of conversations. I was saying in our group, I don't know, maybe I need to broaden my acquaintances, but I have neighbors who have very different views than me, but my friends really, and my family, they all have similar views to my own. I would really like to have a way to have groups where these conversations can happen, because I'm really very interested in our country starting to heal.
Well, you've said a very profound reality, Kathy, is that our housing patterns and our friendship patterns, we have become more homogeneous. We don't hang out with people who think differently than we do. So we actually have to create that opportunity. I'll give you 3 examples. And I think league chapters might want to start this, but a couple things that we've run into across the country where people just spontaneously did it themselves. I'll give you 3 examples, one of which was in Tucson, where one Presbyterian church, which was very liberal, connected with a different Protestant church. I'm not going to remember what their denomination was, but who was very conservative, because the Presbyterians realized that they were all thought the same thing, more or less. So they joined hands with a congregation that was much more conservative and started creating social events for them to have these conversations with one another. So I thought that was a very good idea. A gentleman in Maine who was very concerned about this and had some experience himself facilitating dialogues started something called makeshift coffee houses. And he has a great website, makeshiftcoffeehouses.org. And he's put up material on his website about how to start a makeshift coffee house in your community. The essence of how he did it was he went to existing coffee shops where people hang out, and he would just identify that they were there for a certain Friday evening to talk about an issue, and they assigned people to tables that were different. Each table had its own facilitator. So picking a venue where people go to hang out, but turning it into this purpose. And one of my favorite stories is a young woman in Cleveland, Ohio, Megan Anderson, who called it, oh man, have I lost track of it? She was mainly working with young people, wanted to focus on young people. So they went to a different bar every Friday night in Cleveland, Ohio, and started bringing patrons together across the divide in bars. And they got so well known for it that they started training people to do it in Erie, Pennsylvania, and someplace else where other people in Eastern Ohio and Western Pennsylvania. I can't, Cheryl, do you remember the name of it?
Craft beer and conversation.
Right, craft beer conversations.
Yeah.
Because that was the essence of it. They went to, and this has happened all over the United States, people who are making their own craft beers. So that's what was unique about it. Thank you so much, Cheryl. So, think of in Flagstaff, in Sedona, I don't know the names of a lot of the other communities in Yavapai County, but think locally. What's a place that people of different views would feel safe to go to, and see if you can't, and maybe it's the league picks one of those places and sees that whether or not the owners would in fact allow for this kind of conversation to happen once a month or eventually once a week. Hope that helps.
A number of league chapters have done what's called sips and civility. So it's along the craft beer or restaurant gathering.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation today. I hate to call it to a close, but we'll be needing to do so. What I'd like to suggest is the people staying for the board meeting, stay on the call. It's 2:41. We'll start at 2:45. It's actually not a board meeting, it's a member meeting today. And then the rest of you who would not like to stay on for that meeting, thank you for joining and goodbye.
And Lynn, can I just say one thing?
Yes.
It's wonderful to have spoken with all of you. And I just want to reiterate, this is some of the most important work we can do for our democracy right now. And we do have an administration who wants to help bridge the divides. And we have millions of Americans like yourselves that know that it has to happen if we're going to rebuild trust between ourselves as people and in our institutions. So thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you.
It's been an honor to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take
Okay,
care.
stand by, Greater Verde Valley Leaguers.